Okay, I'm not sure I can live up to that, and competing with the sensory pleasures of sunlight and wine is not easy. Thank you very, very much for inviting me here. I feel as if somebody's going to pinch me and I'm going to wake up in a seminar room in Gower Street. I'll try and keep this reasonably short. What I originally thought I would do, because I thought it'd be interesting and I wanted to sort of look further into it, is go over some of the ideas about time that we find in one of my areas, classical German philosophy, which means Kant and the German idealists, but with the intention of avoiding anything expository or kind of scholarly. I sort of ended up just taking bits and pieces and trying to put them together as a loosely unified train of thought. So what I'm going to say touches here and there on insights in Kant and post-Kantian thinkers, but doesn't really give them a proper hearing. Anyway, I'm coming late in the day, and anything one says at this point is all too likely to be a footnote to something that somebody said either earlier today or yesterday, so I'm well aware of that. I think the main thing I wanted to convey, focus on really, is just what I see, the sheer difficulty of understanding what time is. And that is, for better or worse, it may not be the most important problem, but it's something that we haven't really talked about very much. I'm going to say less about transience and ephemera. So, if nothing else, I just hope to give a sense of why it may be thought that time poses an especially deep philosophical problem. And then, somewhat self-indulgently at the end, if there's time, I'll just describe Schelling's solution to it, which to my mind is agreeably strange. So to start, I think we all think there is a clear difference between being able to think and talk about things in time and being able to say what time itself is. So being able to talk and think about things in time requires a language, words like now, then, yet, being able to decline verbs and so on, and at a higher level of sophistication in order to give objective positions in time to the things that happen. We need some sort of system of units of time, days, hours, and so on, and to be able to relate these to something in nature, atomic clock or the seasons, whatever it might be. So all of that is unproblematic, relatively speaking. Saying what time is, by contrast, in the distinctive, demanding sense peculiar to philosophy, saying what time is essentially or in itself generates the consternation recorded in this famous remark of Augustine's, which I assume resonates with everybody, or at least that it did the first time you came across it. So he asks, what then is time? If no one asks of me, I know. If I wish to explain to him who asks, I know not. And he implores praise to God to help him understand, as he puts it, this most entangled enigma. Now, interesting, worth noting that Augustine is led to raise this question not by thinking, as we would, about the circumstances of human knowledge or human existence, but by thinking about God. God, as an eternal being, must have existed before the world began, and this provokes Augustine to raise the question of what God was doing, as it were, before creation. Now, it may be thought, and I think this is would be the view of many contemporary philosophers, that Augustine's puzzlement is unnecessary and unjustified. So it may be pointed out there are several obvious, perfectly good things that we can say about time. Some of them I've already referred to. Time is a fundamental dimension of things in the world, alongside space. Time can be measured and mapped with a system of dates. We can describe temporal facts by using tensed verbs, words like now, and so on. And then there are all of those other propositions from Aristotle that Mark put on their handout yesterday. No time without change, no change without time, and so on. So the question arises, why isn't this enough? Why can't we claim to know time fully just by virtue of knowing how to talk about things in time? Why think there's anything more to be known? And the contemporary philosopher is very likely to say that the only reason really why Augustine finds time puzzling is because he started at the wrong end. He started with eternity, and and then found time puzzling. But if we don't, as the modern philosopher, of course, won't start up there with God, then it's not so clear why we should be puzzled about time. So what I'm going to present is an argument, or that's to dignify it, but a train of thought for why one might think that time poses a difficulty, and that there must be something more to be known or said about it than is said when we talk about how we talk about things in time. So everyone will agree, I think, that time can be represented as a line, a single straight line without thickness, without definite beginning or end. And in fact, so this is Kant's claim, we must model time on a line if we are to think of events in the world as ordered. And these events would include our own mental life as occurring objectively, one after the other. So this quotation, not too obscure, I think, by Kant's standards, he writes, for in order that we may make inner alterations, by which he just means successive changes in our own mental states, in order that we may make these thinkable, we must represent time figuratively as a line, and the inner alteration through the drawing of this line. And so in this manner, by means of outer, that is spatial intuition, make comprehensible the successive existence of ourselves in different states. So the thought here is very simply, for our purposes, that, of course, in order to think that I'm now in this room, I don't need to use any particular model of time, or that I'm now in pain, or that there is light. But in order for me to think that my being in Venice is something that happened or is happening later than my boarding of the flight at Heathrow and so on, for that I do need to represent time as a line, implicitly, if not explicitly. A footnote here, but it's sufficiently interesting, I think, just to throw in. Some anthropologists have disputed this and have tried to suggest that the data, when you look at least some other cultures, shows that this way of thinking about time, the linear way that submits to quantification and allows for numbering and so on, the Aristotelian way that we talked about yesterday, they've suggested that actually this is optional, or at least not shared universally. So the claim has been that there are some cultures, Edmund Leach, I think, made this claim in very strong terms, some cultures just don't have that idea about time at all. Rather, they map things by referring to different conditions and different things that one can do. So there is being married, unmarried, the giving of brides, receiving of brides, and so on. So the idea would be that in that world, one switched, alternated from being like a light switch or a setting, from being in one state to being in another. I mean, these accounts are extraordinarily interesting, but I think they don't. And there is a superb book on this, which I recommend if anybody is interested, by Anthony Gell, called The Anthropology of Time. The evidence doesn't really show anything of the sort. If these cultures are thinking about time rather than something else like relative social positions and so on, then we've got to interpret them as being able to map something in a linear way. I mean, otherwise we couldn't say that they thought of the marriage as having taken place after the river flooded or whatever it might be. So the first point is just the necessity for representing time as a line in order that we be able to think of time in an objective way. But clearly, and this is a point that's been made at least once, a line is not enough to capture time, or at least to characterize time simply and merely as a line would imply directly that it's some sort of fourth dimension additional to the familiar three Euclidean dimensions. So, in order to differentiate time from space, what do? We say time moves, time flows, time passes. And Kant has already made that point for us when he added, and the inner alteration, we represent that through the drawing, the action of this line, motion. This notion that time involves essentially movement, or directionality. Again, it was implicit in the account of time that Mark talked about yesterday in Heidegger. I think Mark used the word spanning or stretching. So it's similarly the same idea of projection forward. So we need movement in order to think time is different from space. And then the question is, and really we're here back to Augustine, so what is the particular way in which time moves? What's the nature of the movement that we're intending to mirror when we take the drawing of a line as a representation of time? And the first observation to make is, of course, that movement appears once again just to be a spatial notion. To move is to change place. It's for a body to be here and then to be there. But of course, that kind of motion can't be the movement that we have in mind when we attribute movement to time. That will get everything the wrong way round. In order for a body to change its place, it's got to already be in time, and time's already got to flow. So one thing one might say here, you might say very plausibly, well, a limit has to come somewhere. The movement of time is not of the same kind. It's of a different kind from the movement of bodies in space. It's sui generis. We can't define it further, but really that's no embarrassment. Rather, that's what's to be expected when we bump up against utterly basic features of reality. And once again, if Augustine had a problem with that, then it's because he was prejudiced. He had this preconception that things, as it were, ought in the first instance to be eternal and would then have to become temporal, and that some explanation would be required for that transition. Now, the next thing I want to, moving on, and here's where the problem, as I want to argue it, begins. So we grant that the movement of time is sui generis and non-spatial. If we say that time moves, or there is movement in time, there are actually two different ways that we may be thinking about it, or two different things that we may have in mind. So let me try and explain these. On the one hand, what we might be thinking is that things move in time. On the other hand, we might be thinking that time itself is moving, that time is characterized by its intrinsic dynamism. So we might be thinking that things travel forward in time, making their way from future to past, or instead, that time just is that movement from future to past. So if we say the first, we're thinking of time as a medium through which things move, or if you like, a ruler by which we calibrate things in their temporal position. If we say the second, then we're saying that time itself is what is in motion, so it's something like an arrow. And of course, the ways we talk generally make use of both of these idioms. We say that the works of the Renaissance have endured throughout the centuries, thinking of them as having kind of moved through time in the same way that you might move a chair from here to there. But we also say, once again, that time flows, or that time passes, time waits for no man, you can't go back in time, all of these thoughts. Now, the problem is that neither of these characterizations of the movement of time taken on its own is adequate. So think about the first. Think about the second first. If time sweeps along, and if it bears things with it, then things are carried along by time. In which case, the relation of things to time, like a passenger on a train, is constant and motionless. So just as a passenger standing on a train looking down at his feet won't see anything moving, so similarly, if we're in time and time is moving, then it follows we shouldn't be aware, and nothing indeed can be in movement at all. So in order for us to move through time, or things to endure through time, time needs to be fixed. It needs to be a framework. It needs to be something in relation to which things change their temporal position. But then, if time is that framework, we've returned to the idea that time is nothing more than a fourth dimension of space. We can't have it that the framework of time is fixed, otherwise it becomes space-like. So we've got to have it that the dimension of time moves, but if it moves, then we seem to move with it, in which case we're standing still. And this seems to me, it's one of those peculiar situations where you've got two different images and each one is kind of correcting, supplying what's missing from the other. And what you might say is, well, this just shows that we need both images, and in a way that's what Kant seemed to be saying when he said we think of time as a line, and then added we think of it also as the drawing of that line. But the problem is very clearly that these two images don't fit together. They're not congruent. If you use the one, then you exclude the other. If you stick the two models on top of one another, then you get double deficiency. You don't get a single image that provides a unified, adequate representation. Now, at the risk of laboring the point, but it seems to me so interesting and important, worth comparing the situation that I'm arguing we're in with respect to time with this familiar thing, the duck rabbit. The duck rabbit is not a problem. You can see it as a duck, you can see it as a rabbit. If you see it as a duck, you don't have to see it as a rabbit. If you see it vice versa. What you certainly don't have to do is to see it as a duck that is a rabbit. However, if the line of argument I've just given is at all cogent, that is precisely how we have to think of time. We have to think of it both as the ruler and also at the same time as the arrow. Well, here, one long quotation, but the prose is French and therefore elegant, from Merleau-Ponty, a philosopher in the tradition of and influenced by Heidegger. And this is really less clumsy statement of the problem. So if I can just read through it. We say that time passes or flows by. We speak of the flow of time. Time presupposes a view upon time. Thus, time is not like a stream. Time is not a fluid substance. This metaphor has been able to survive since Heraclitus up until today because we surreptitiously place in the river a witness to its flowing. Now, from the moment I introduce the observer, depending on whether he follows the flow of the river, meaning in a boat, or whether he observes its passage from the riverbank, the temporal relations are reversed. In the second case, the masses of water that have already gone by do not head towards the future, they sink into the past. The still to come, l'avenir, or le avenir, is on the side of the source, and time does not come from the past. The past does not drive the present into being, nor does the present drive the future into being. The future is not prepared behind the observer, it is planned out in front of him, like the storm on the horizon. But if, to switch model, if the observer is now placed in a boat and follows the current, it can certainly be said that he descends with it towards his future. But the future is in those new landscapes that await him at the estuary, and the flow of time is no longer the stream itself, but is rather the unfolding of the landscapes for the moving observer. Thus, time is neither a real process nor an actual succession that I could limit myself simply to recording. So Merleau-Ponty's, the thought is that this river analogy that comes to us so naturally is on scrutiny, it reveals itself to be inadequate. It confuses two different things. Well, if you agree that that makes sense, then we have the question, so where does this leave us? And it means, I think, that in the first instance, our representation of time, this being, of course, representation not of things in time, but of time itself, is inconsistent. We only concede in convincing ourselves otherwise because we oscillate incoherently between the two models. And if that's right, then secondly, we must consider ourselves to have failed to grasp time in itself. And this, it seems to me, is one of those extraordinary points that one comes to in philosophy where a decision needs to be made on which a great deal will be found to depend, or to put it the other way around, which way you go here depends upon what you think about a great number of other very fundamental things. And there are, I suggest, three options. The first option is to affirm the dynamism of time, is to say that indeed the movement of time is intrinsic to time, but to deny the reality of time. The second option is to affirm the reality of time, but to deny that it is inherently dynamic in the sense that we've been trying to capture. And the third option is to affirm the reality and the dynamism of time. To map these very, very briefly onto relevant historical figures, and the first position is Kant's and also Augustine's and some other idealists. The second position is the kind of position that you would expect a contemporary scientific realist to take. And the third position really takes some work, and that is Schelling's position and also Hegel's, I think. So let me just run through them. I'm not going to begin to attempt to offer an argument for going one way or the other. I just want to say something about what each of the options involves. And much of what I'm going to say is really, I think, quite obvious. So the first possibility, affirming the dynamism of time but denying its reality, what would that mean? Well, the thought would be we set out to grasp time in itself, and we encountered inconsistency or paradox. And the explanation for that, it may be suggested, is just that there is no such thing as time in itself. Time does not exist in itself. It contains an appearance of movement, and that's because time, and it can do so because time itself is a mere appearance. And once we appreciate that time exists only as appearance, then we stop expecting to be able to comprehend it. It's no wonder that it resists rationalization and comprehension. So we can rest happy with Kant's gloss on it as a line or as the motion of the drawing of the line. We know that the line and the drawing of the line don't capture the essence of time, but there is no essence to be captured. Now, philosophers who take this option, like Kant and in a very different way, Augustine, at least in Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy may be very different, they're happy to do this because they think it costs us nothing. And indeed, we make gains by derealizing time. So, I'm not going to expand on this, but on Kant's view, and of course that of Augustine, it's okay, you lose nothing by denying the real reality of time, because you also have independently access to that which is eternal. And that which is eternal provides for the things that really matter: free will, salvation, morality, and so on. So that's the cell for the first option. The second possibility, the second option already referred to, this idea of time as simply a fourth dimension or something that isn't deeply different from the 3 or 3 plus n dimensions of space. And this is a position that many philosophers, naturalistically inclined philosophers, and of course theoretical physicists, presumably, will be entirely happy with. They will say time is another mathematically describable dimension in which things are extended as they are in space. It differs from the familiar Euclidean dimensions in various ways. You can go up and down in space, but you can't go back and forwards in time. But that doesn't require us to say that time has this sui generis dynamic to it. Now, one response to this is, we call it naive incredulity. And just to say very quickly why I think the naturalist has a good answer to this. So the incredulous response is, how can it possibly be that the movement of time is an illusion? I mean, it's given to me immediately with absolute certainty. I'm as sure of the movement of time as I am of my thinking. Indeed, my thinking is a projecting of my conception or my understanding into the future. How can you take that away from me? Well, the naturalist should say, indeed, of course, yes, you have the appearance. There is this seeming. I'm not denying that. But, as we were shown yesterday, appearances are deceptive. And indeed, those things which seem to us to be immediately given, those are the things upon which our suspicions should fall most of all. So that would be the way that I think a scientific realist might proceed to defend that option. Well, of course, there's a great deal more to be said about what happens if you go for number 2, reality of the self, freedom, value, and so on. I'm not going to embark on anything like that. So, the third option, what would it be? And again, all I want to do is just describe what it involves. So the third option can be made good if we can explain why dynamism is essential to time and why time can be regarded as fully real, despite the fact that there is this paradoxical or conflicting element involved in our thought of time. And this is Schelling's solution, which I should immediately say I'm presenting in an extremely compressed way, certainly not doing justice to him. And the metaphysical picture that I'm going to describe here, he doesn't develop it exclusively as a solution to the problem of time. It's motivated from left, right, and center. And it's a kind of pantheism. Now, I said Augustine prayed to God, whom he took to be eternal, to help him understand time. In Schelling's view, what he should instead have asked, this would have been the right question, is what God needs to be like in order for time to issue from him, as it must have done in some sense, if it is to have reality. Everything that has reality must be grounded appropriately in God. So, if time is to be real, then it must make sense to God, and that means God must have a nature which is consistent with and provides for the reality of time. Now, all of this makes it sound very much as if we're trying to solve our problem of understanding time by getting God to share it, as it were, passing the buck or dragging God, who is supposed to resolve the enigma, inside the enigma itself. Well, in a way that is the strategy, but it's well conceived in the following way. If it is true that the paradoxicality of time, the puzzle that time poses for our understanding, is an intrinsic feature of God, if he too has that shape, then since explanation necessarily comes to an end with God, or if you think that the theistic title here isn't earned, then let's call it the absolute. If you think that the shape of time is possessed by the absolute, then you've come to an end of explanation. So if you could show or make it plausible that God has a temporal character, not, of course, exactly our clock time character, but some kind of structure that is analogous to or corresponds to the division of time into past, present, and future. If you could do that, then you would solve the problem of time, you would rationalize it, simply by virtue of having shown that there is nothing that there is no residue, there is nothing further to understand. And Schelling, this is Schelling's strategy, and there is a great deal to be said in its favor, he thinks. Sort of to pick up a point that Roger made earlier today, Schelling points out that if you think, as Augustine did, and as we naturally do, of eternity as utter stillness, then you do God a disservice in a way, and you do us a disservice. For an utter stillness, something that is merely self-identical, cannot recognize itself as such. If God is to have reality, God must know himself or itself to be real. And that kind of knowledge is precluded if God is just isness, the isness of being God, as it were, hyphenated. So, for God's own sake, and of course for ours, in order that he can be the kind of thing to which we can have a relation, it's necessary to impute, or we have reason to want to impute, a kind of structure to God, rather than regarding God as, or eternity as simply this sheer featureless blank. Well, Schelling has a very great deal to say about this, and I think I'll finish in a second, but the main points are that God is thought of by Schelling as Schelling sometimes puts it, giving himself being. Schelling thinks that that's a concomitant of our regarding God as free. God must not be something that has to be. God must be something that is free to either be or not be, and makes himself or itself be. So God is, perhaps putting it slightly less paradoxically, God is something that must give itself actuality. Now, Schelling thinks that, and this picks up on a remark Geoffrey made yesterday about the combination of order and adventure in music. Schelling thinks that when we think about nature, when we think about our own subjectivity, our thoughts always tend to reveal two fundamental directions or vectors or forces, one of which he calls contraction, and which shows up in nature as gravity, and the other of which he calls he calls expansion, which shows up in nature as light. And the suggestion, the story, perhaps the tall story that he's telling, is that God's production of himself or itself as having a past and a present and a future can be understood in terms of the interaction of those two forces. If anyone were to accept this story, many things then become possible. We have a universe which is not yet ethically characterized, but it's very natural to think of the force of contraction, withdrawing into selfhood, as, if not evil, then at least the basis for evil. Whereas the expansive principle, light, corresponds to the drive or the will to revelation and love. And Schelling is, at the end of the day, a Christian of sorts. So, to conclude, the attraction or the interest of this very, very strange metaphysical picture, and this is an advantage that it has, whatever other disadvantages it may have in relation to the other two options that I described, is it allows us to think that simply in virtue of being conscious of time in the distinctive way that we are, and that the lectern is not, conscious of ourselves as having lives to dispose of, existing within time, we thereby, in a sense, participate in God. Being in time is participating in God's making himself or giving himself actuality. And if that's right, then, to return to the original Augustinian question, then the perplexity that we feel when we try and think about time is entirely appropriate, because it, in a sense, it's what you ought to expect if you look God squarely in the face. God won't yield to understanding of an ordinary kind. So the assurance that we have, the best assurance that we have for the reality of time is that it gives us this, that it resists our understanding and has this paradoxical shape or character to it. Okay, thank you.
That was a wonderful lecture. Now, because you mentioned at the end time as God, and then you brought in the absolute as another form to make that point, and then obviously you were sort of juggling with that worry of how to make sense of this sort of attempt to understand time. You quoted Augustine at the beginning, saying that I know it as soon as I have to tell you what it is. I don't know it anymore. And of course, talking of time as the absolute does, bring up the romantic worry about representing or talking of the absolute, and frequent references of them saying the absolute isn't, it's indemonstrable, it cannot be represented. So I was wondering whether you could perhaps talk about the methodology involved in thinking about time and the sort of the link to representation, really. I mean, we heard about Las Meninas from, the
I mean, I think this is too big. This
Yeah.
is too much for me to. We should certainly talk about this.
Yeah.
I mean, you're absolutely right that Schelling represents. I mean, I had three options, but the Romantic is going to be a fourth, and maybe Merleau-Ponty, maybe Heidegger also should be also represented as other distinct options. Schelling's view is, his claim, his ambition, is that we can have a wissenschaftlich, systematic understanding of all things. So Schelling will not rest content with anything of the sort that the Romantics offer us. So his claim is that this is, the skeptical claim or the Kantian claim is that, as Roger had it, here we encounter the limit, here representation stops, and then for Kant we can just think beyond it, for the Romantics something else. Schelling's claim is to go to the other side of the wall, to take us over. Whether or not this succeeds is another matter altogether, but it's something different.
Gosh, I enjoy that a lot. It does seem to me that Schelling's solution is a very high-cost solution to a problem that can perhaps dissolve on closer inspection. Seems to me there are two things that you had difficulty with because they were incompatible. But I think each of the things you have difficulty with themselves dissolve on closer inspection. First of all, the notion that time flows and sweeps events into the present and then into the past. That really raises all sorts of questions about what speed it flows at, what it flows in, and people say, well, time flows 1 second per second and so on and so forth. But it does also suggest that, for example, T1 has some kind of prenatal existence, enters into the present, and then has a posthumous existence. So perhaps that very image of time itself flowing is riddled with contradictions. The alternative image of events, as it were, flowing in time has the same problem as well.
Yes.
For example, this meeting in Venice would presumably have to have an antenatal existence, a current existence, and then a posthumous existence. And clearly that's not the case. So both of those limbs of the antinomies that you can't put together actually dissolve on closer inspection. And I just wonder whether the very idea of the dynamism of time is the result of ascribing to time properties of events.
Yeah. Well, I agree with everything that you've said. I agree that all of those contradictions are, one only has to scratch the surface and the image dissolves. The question is whether or not, once you've eliminated both of the alternatives, what then is left? And the argument, the thought here is that, well, we need something. Something is needed in order to convey what it is to have this, to put it all in terms of self-conscious subjects, to be pointed in the way that we are, anticipating the future. And anything that you say at this point is almost going to be too much. But the claim, at any rate, is that it's constitutive of self-consciousness, that it has this, and here one has to use metaphors, indispensably, this thrust or this trajectory to it.
It may be the case that it's wrong to think of time as dynamic. Equally wrong, by the way, to think of it as static. Just because prime numbers aren't green doesn't mean to say they're red.
Yeah.
And it just so I just wondered whether the whole dynamic, static, as it were, division is probably inappropriate time. And we go back to the notion of time as sua generis, to which you cannot apply properties that apply, for example, to events. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, I think that is the second option, with some difference. But what you lose on that, your gains, one's gains in clarity and consistency are incalculable. What you lose is grasping this, whatever it is, that is, so the claim goes, distinctive of self-consciousness in a practical mode. Now, if one were going to try and unsettle this picture, and I've already indicated I don't really know how you would refute that kind of view, one would perhaps say something like, well, suppose that is the case, suppose that time is as you recommend that we think of it. In a sense, it then follows that we, in living our lives, are fictional or imaginary. Because this process, this forward-pointed process that grips us from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, that is an illusion. It's not grounded in anything. So the thought would be that the cost, that in a way the cost of accepting that picture is to make our existence as anything that is distinctive or has a dimension to it that is not shared by other things in the material, the natural world. That just goes.
Just a brief question. I was really struck by your remark that it was also Hegel's position in addition to Schelling's position. Do you think it's basically the same view?
No, I don't think it is, but I think Hegel would tick the proposition number 3 there, but for different reasons and understand it in a different way. Time is not important for Hegel in the way that it is for Schelling. Indeed, the texts that I've drawn on for this are ones that Schelling composed in 1816. And this is in a period when Schelling is dissatisfied with Hegel's rationalism. Hegel has a 4-page discussion of the nature of time in his philosophy of nature. And it affirms the dynamism of time and affirms its reality. But it doesn't grant it the theological, metaphysical significance that Schelling wants to accord it. So, yes.